Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you in person and online. Today we have this guest lecture by Professor Chris Eccleston. In starting this lecture, I wish to tell you a little bit about the Placebo Beyond Opinions Center at University of Maryland School of Nursing. We are a group of interdisciplinary researchers, and our goal is to advance both education about placebo, expectation, and of course, research. The goal is to understand the mechanism of placebo and expectancy on symptom variability, treatment responses, and how the encounter can make a difference. We seek to improve clinical trials, educate future clinicians, and integrate placebo knowledge into precision medicine. And it was fun because the other day I was somehow talking to someone who doesn't do research, and he asked me why PBO. So I decided to tell you today why we talk about the PBO. So mostly the reason why we name our center Placebo Beyond Opinion is because we want to go beyond the mere assumption around placebo and expectations. And the goal is to try to understand why eventually expectancy as well as placebo effects can change brain mechanisms and other responses when we treat pain and other symptoms. So Placebo Beyond Opinions, the PBO match very well with placebo as words, but importantly, we wanted to have this knowledge that goes beyond assumptions and actually delve into research that is scientific based. And our dedication is to advance the evidence-based research around placebo and expectations. And now I would love to introduce our speaker. We are very pleased to have Professor Chris Eccleston from Bath, London, UK. It is a very honor to welcome our international speaker, not because only he is a friend, but a supporter of the lab, but most important, a leader in the fields of pain. So we expect to learn a lot about pain based on his extensive research. So Professor Eccleston is the director of the Center for Pain Research that I had the pleasure to visit last June. He has published over 300 papers that have made a difference in the way we conceive the psychology of pain, and this impact factor is impressive. Professor Eccleston founded and directed the Bath Pain Management Unit from 1994 to 2008, including the first residential pediatric pain program. He consults internationally on new services and team training in pain management. Also, from 2009 to 2019, he served as the psychology editor for the Journal of Pain, for Pain Journal, and also he coordinates different other initiatives related to palliative and support care Cochrane review group, again, to try to understand the evidence beyond what we do. Also, he's an author of 3 books for Oxford University Press. In 2016, he published Embodied, the Psychology of Physical Perception. And more recently, he also published another book that is entitled Work and Pain, a Lifespan Development Approach. So with all of you, I would love to welcome Professor Eccleston to the podium. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And that was a terrific introduction. Wow, thank you. I'll try not to talk about all of those different things, but I was pleased that you mentioned this embodied idea, because that's what I want to try and bring home to you today. And I really have an ambition here to do 2 things. One is to link the way I think about physical sensation and the fact of us all having a body, which comes as a surprise to many people until it goes wrong. especially psychologists, who tend to think of the body merely as a taxi for the mind to take you from one place to another. I want to really try and get us to thinking again about the psychology of physical sensation, what it means to have a body. And then also link that with, as Luana nicely mentioned, with the ideas of intervention, things we can do to help people. So let's just jump in. I did write this book called Embodied, The Psychology of Physical Sensation, but for a long time it was laboring under the title of the 10 neglected senses. Now, they're not neglected from a human point of view. If you work in healthcare, as most of you do, this is what you see probably every day. People talking about balance problems, movement problems, respiration problems, fatigue, pain, itch, thermoregulatory problems, appetite. These are what we do every day. Is that not right? However, if you were to study the psychology, if you take a Psychology 101 textbook out now and you open it, or a textbook of perception, that is, of sensation and perception, anybody remember what most of that book will be about? Anybody? Is it too long ago to remember? Most of it will be about vision. Right? And then there'll be a whole section on audition, and then right at the back, there'll be a chapter that says, oh, and you have a body as well. And let's talk about pain, and let's talk about itch, and let's talk about fatigue. And I wanted to flip it, because actually I think this is what people are interested in. So each of these chapters, for a small moment, focuses on each of these physical sensations. What do we mean by an embodied approach? It is in that broad way that you are, in that broad way that we are all embodied, and that body is embedded within culture. But at the same time, there's a very specific evolutionary view, or a functional view, of why these physical sensations have developed in the way that they have, and how they operate to protect the organism, you and I, how they protect us from threat, how they maintain coherent behavior and protect you from threat. And actually, in some ways, they're very simple, and that's why many people think that the psychology of perception is uninteresting when it comes to these physical sensations, because they only do one thing. But I'm here to argue that actually they're very interesting. So you don't have a perception of balance, you have a perception of imbalance, and it does only one thing, which is to get the organism to return a sense of balance. When you're moving out of control, you understand you're moving out of control, it interrupts you, you want to return control. Each of these senses has evolved in a very particular and peculiar way. Some of them aren't what you think they are. Itch, for example, the only thing it does is promote scratch. That's all itch does. And it's really a hygiene behavior to remove parasites from your environment. That's what it's evolved to do, is to get you to actually remove things from your skin. Similarly, fatigue we think is about tiredness, but it isn't. It's really about something else. It's about the urge to switch away from an unrewarding persistence of a behavior. So if you keep doing the same thing, you'll get tired, you'll get fatigued, and you'll want to be doing something else long before you get biologically out of resource, you will be switched away. So each of these senses has a very narrow function, and it urges a very specific behavior. Unlike vision, which is generalized to multiple behaviors, as is audition, these are very specific. And most of the time, they work beautifully well. Except sometimes they don't. And sometimes when they go wrong, that's when we have to pay attention to them. So what would an embodied view, if you take that embodied view of all of these different senses and think about it from a pain perspective, how might we come to think about these different senses? Well, I've argued that actually they're all about protection. They're all about protecting you from a very specific form of threat. And they all operate broadly and crudely at these three different levels. Level one is physiological homeostasis out of awareness. So most of the time, I will walk now. Most of the time, I'm quite clever, right? So I can walk upright, balanced. I don't need to think about it. But if you tilt me to a certain point, then I will become aware of that tilt. And then I'll need to switch out of this automatic level into interruption, and I behave to return protection. So crudely, most of the time we're operating in each of our senses between these two levels. This one where you don't need to think about it, respiration, for example, you don't need to think about the thousands of breaths that you take all of the time until you become apneic, and then you really need to think about it to protect you. It's probably the best example. Simple schematic in that sense. Most of us operate this way. And actually, I like that respiration example because most of us are really living only about 30 seconds away from panic at any one time in our lives. It's true. You're able to sit here thinking wonderful ideas about 14th century French poetry and what I'm going to have for dinner and whether my neighbors remember to take the dog out or not. You do all of the wonderful things in your life. But really, we're only living away from being able to think about one thing and one thing only, which is to be able to take a breath or to get rid of something that's itching on me, or when pain takes over. But luckily, we understand these systems and they operate mostly automatically. As a psychologist, I'm mostly interested in this middle level, which is what do you do when your body interrupts you and interferes with all those wonderful plans in your life? What beliefs do you bring to bear? What attitudes matter? What behaviors matter? What cultural influences matter? How other people speak to you matter? How you structure your sense of identity matters. All of that comes in here. And then lastly, each of these senses has a way, a level 3 way, of when you can no longer manage whatever the threat of that sensation is at that level 2. There is a way, ultimately, that we dissociate from that sensation. You dissociate from your body. And perhaps it's a talk for another day, but I'll focus on it with pain. But the ways in which you dissociate of each of these sensations is very peculiar and very particular to the individual sensation, and not necessarily easy to manage, because once you get to that dissociative defense, then you are, there's no way back from it. So there's a schematic. I've given you this very strong sense. Welcome, please. I've given you this very strong sense that we have these 10 neglected bodily senses. They're not neglected by patients. They're not neglected in nursing care in particular. They're certainly not neglected in palliative care where I've worked. They're pretty much the thrust of everyday life. They're not neglected in clinic and in the hospital, but they are neglected in the study of psychology, if you like. And I've also said that each of them are evolved in a particular way, and each of them operates at these 3 different levels. And pain is one of these. And pain is I need to tell you perhaps, but pain is a really tricky conceptual problem as well as an individual challenge to many people. These are just some UK data that show that 24% of people, 1 in 4 adults in the UK have chronic pain. So that's pain that lasts for 3 months or longer. Can be episodic. It could be headache. It could be menstrual pain. It could be migraine. Or it can be persistent for many people. But these are just UK data. You think this opioid oversupply and overuse of opioids is a crisis in North America. It's also growing in Western Europe and in particular in the UK. And we see that a quarter of those are on opioid painkillers. And many people have to wait a long time to access treatment. So this is no surprise to those of you who study pain. It's not just the UK. We also published a book called European Pain Management, which was a survey of all 39 European countries, a broader definition of Europe in that case. And it's quite an interesting, you don't need to buy it. If you're interested in Europe, I'll send you a copy. What it really is a way of saying what's happening across all of these different countries. What's their infrastructure? What's their workforce? What are they trying to struggle with? How many people are they struggling to help? What you find, of course, is that actually these numbers are across the whole of Europe and all countries. The 20% of adults. That's a conservative estimate of reporting chronic pain, and adolescents as well. Now, there are 450 million people in Europe. That's 20 to 25% is about 140 million people with chronic pain. That's the population of France and Germany combined. So there's an awful lot of people who could be helped by chronic pain management, but not all of them need our help. And this is one of the things that I wanted to bring home. This is some work we've been doing recently as part of this consortium to research individual, interpersonal and social influences in pain. We have a large research consortium at the University of Bath. And this is the first paper that we published from that consortium because we're interested in predicting the onset and maintenance of chronic pain. And really, the bottom line from this paper is that actually we really need to start thinking more clearly about the small proportion of people with high impact chronic pain. Because not everybody who has chronic pain finds that they can't cope with it. We just don't know very much about those people who do very well with it, because they, by definition, they don't present to healthcare. They're often not asking for our help. They're a sort of a hidden population. And also it waxes and wanes a little bit. We tend to think clumsily that some people are always going to have chronic pain and some people aren't. And I guess the critical issue for me as a psychologist is I'm often interested, I don't know whether this works, well, not necessarily. I'm often interested in, not necessarily in curing pain. This is a debate that we could have, and it's a debate that's actually raging in the pain literature at the moment, is that I'm arguing quite strongly that a realistic treatment outcome for many people with high impact chronic pain is for us to shift them from high to low impact chronic pain. It's what we can do well. Moving them to a situation where they no longer have pain is much more difficult. And the reason I hesitate when I say that is that there is a different voice. It's not my voice, but there is a different voice who think, and when I say that, I think, Chris, you're being nihilistic. You're being, you need to try harder. We should have analgesia as a goal. And I worry about that because I think it's a laudable goal, but I'm not sure in my experience it's a realistic goal. But it's a debate that we could have and a debate that's raging at the moment. So often what we're thinking about in chronic pain management is not necessarily a management of the pain, but a management of people trying to learn how to manage their pain so that its impact is less strong in their life. And just to share that maybe some people here are interested in pediatrics, we were lucky enough to run a special commission in pediatric pain for the Lancet. So Lancet Commission in Pediatric Pain a number of years ago, and this is the 30,000 word document that came out of it. So, and what we find is that, what we wrote it is that there need to be 4 goals for action in it, and these are the 4 goals. I think we need to fundamentally make pain matter. In other words, have make it possible to talk about children's pain, and that young people and infants and neonates actually have pain. This may come as a surprise, perhaps not in this room, but there's still an idea out there that young children and infants and newborns don't experience pain. So you can have analgesia without any help. So I think we really need to be talking about making pain matter. And actually, that's almost a sociological principle. Maybe I'm obsessed by the things that come at the end of textbooks. But often when you write a piece like this, it will start with the biology and the mechanism. Then it'll go to assessment. Then it'll go to treatment. And then at the back, there'll be a social policy piece that nobody reads. I wanted to flip it. And we flip this completely. So the first part of it is, why don't we talk about pain? How do we bring it out into the open? How do we make things matter? Why is there such a social influence around us not being able to talk about it? And then can we understand it better? Do we need to understand the mechanism better? Can we make it visible by accepting that everybody has a right to assessment? And then, of course, can we make it better through treatment? So in a way, as we get to this embodied view, I'm just trying to share that this is important for young people as well as their parents. Let's go back to an embodied view of pain. If you take this functionalist approach, the pain has evolved to protect you from harm and the threat of harm, and to warn other conspecifics in your environment, other people in your environment, that there's danger in your environment. That's what pain does, and it does it very well. The reason you shout out loudly in pain is not necessarily because you want to release any Freudian suffering. It's more because you want to tell other people around you that there might be danger in that environment. This is a very old evolutionarily driven behavior. It's about protection. So what do we mean by this sort of embodied view? Well, we know that pain is inevitable, except for a very small proportion of people, a very tiny group of people. We know it's always related to action. To do nothing when you're in pain is fundamentally strange. You will always be acting. It's a motivational concept. It's not a purely sensory concept. It's fundamentally egocentric. It pulls you back in on yourself and thinking about yourself. And that's not because you are fundamentally selfish or unusual in any way. It's hard to engage with the world when you're being pulled back literally on yourself at all times. I mean, it functions to protect you by dragging your attention away from the rest of the interesting world and back to whatever might be causing that threat. And it urges escape and avoidance. So this interruptive function, this ability to go from level 1, remember, automated, going around the world, happily avoiding harm and danger and damage, to suddenly you need to be the one who's actually, you're interrupted by this threat, and you need to be the one who's acting to avoid it and warn other people. Now, I'm laboring it, but it might sound straightforward to you. I'm laboring it because this isn't the way we normally think about pain. We think about it as a direct sensory input that needs to be attenuated. And I'm asking you not to think about it that way. I'm asking you to think about its evolutionary context and how it drives your behavior and the behavior of other people in your environment. Because if we think about it that way, we get closer to understanding what treatment might be like. And this is not a new idea. This is Pat Wall, the first editor of the journal Pain, who was Sherrington Professor of Physiology at University College London. And he said back in 1979, which is back in the dark ages, that pain is better classified as an awareness of a need state than as a sensation. You need to think about it more like hunger and thirst that's driving the whole organism toward a set of behaviors than you do thinking about it as seeing or hearing. Because that's what it does. This urge to avoid harm we've written about here in Pain and Topical Review a number of years ago. And that was the summary that this, just if you're interested in these papers. If they're going too quickly, I can send you the summary of what I'm talking about today. So I'm encouraging you to think about pain as a form of embodied defense. It's ultimately driving protection. So if I've convinced you of that, the question then becomes, so what? Okay, you say, I believe you, Chris. That's fine. I'm going to go with this. But so what? What does that mean for how we might approach treatment? So the first thing to remember is let's think about chronic pain from that perspective. I think of it as a system fault. You almost become stuck in that environment. And actually, the same works for other interoception, like chronic itch or chronic fatigue in particular, that we are driven to engage as human beings. Unless you're really depressed or you have another psychopathology, then what you're interested in is actually engaging in the world. Not quite like sharks always moving forward, but mostly, well, you might know some of those, but mostly we are. We actually need to engage with the world. And what pain almost does is just keeps stopping you from doing that every time you do it. It's like being on the starting blocks of an athletics track and you're just about to go and you get pulled back. Imagine that you're engaged to do that. Excuse me. And imagine if that were happening all of the time. I mean, I'll give you a quick example, right? Quick example. Imagine you were in a lecture theatre or a seminar. It's a thought experiment. It's just a thought experiment. You don't have to do this. So it's not a real experiment. It's a thought experiment. And I know what happens, so that makes it not an experiment. So imagine you're in a lecture theatre. Can you do that? It's amazing, isn't it? Brilliant. You all got that. So imagine you're there, and imagine you're listening to this amazing talk. Go with me. Just imagine that. But you're really trying to concentrate. It's a bit weird. It's an odd accent. It's repeating himself a lot. He's in the laboring. It's really interesting, but I'm going with it. Right? Have you got that? Imagine that. But imagine now, please don't do this. It's a thought experiment, that the person behind you really wants your attention. So what they do is they lean forward and they tap you on the shoulder. So now you've got two things in your environment. You've got this incredibly amazing lecture going on in the front. Really interesting. Not quite sure where it's going, but want to concentrate on it. And now you've got, your world has just doubled. You've got this other person behind you. This person is really quite insistent. They want your attention, so they keep doing it harder. Please don't do this. They keep so much so they're starting to hurt, and you're thinking, oh, I missed what he said. Maybe that was important. Suddenly you've got these two things going on. And then that's not very pleasant, is it? It's a bit like being in chronic pain. But imagine then, that goes even further, the person actually leans forward and they whisper in your ear and they say, you're useless. See, you missed that. Didn't even hear it. Did see? Why did you even bother coming? Because you can't concentrate. You can't listen. You're just taking up space. Why don't you go? Can you imagine that? Please don't do that. If you can imagine that, then you get a little bit closer to the experience of what being a chronic pain patient is like. Not only have you got this repeated interruption by a painful resetting of your attention that drags you away from the rest of the world and all of the behaviors that you want to engage with, but then you've got this overlay, not a word I use very much as a psychologist, but you've got this overlay that comes on top of it, of these negative emotions and beliefs and attitudes. And of course, there isn't anybody else doing that. Who's doing that? You're doing it yourself, right? Saying it to yourself, I can't do this, I'm useless, I can't. It's called depression. We have a word for it. If you can imagine that, it all starts from interruption. It all starts from this functional view that you're trying to get on in the world and you get dragged back to it. And if that happens, and it happens not once in one lecture theatre, it's happening 4 times a day, 5 times a day, it's happening every day, it's happening every week, it's happening every month, it's happening for years before you get to see a healthcare professional who understands it. How much is that negative learning experience locking in this pattern of behavior that actually gets the whole system stuck and drives that disability? It's quite depressing when you think about it. So, what that means is not only do you have chronic pain, but you have chronic interruption. And imagine even if the pain wasn't being painful, you just constantly interrupted all the time, that would be quite difficult. You've got chronic interference in your life. And ultimately, you have chronic identity challenge. You start thinking about yourself in a different way. I'm not the person, I'm not this person anymore. I've lost sense of who I was. So I call a colleague of mine, Stephen Morley, who's no longer with us, I call these the eyes of Morley, the 3 eyes that he discussed, that Johann Stephen and Piet, in this case, wrote quite beautifully, these 3 eyes. And actually, the reason that that's interesting is because this, good news is this, we can do something about. I might not be able to take your pain away, but this, we know what to do with. So here are treatment models. Remember, there are 3 levels where we have physiological homeostasis without awareness. So you've got that self-protection system that's working quite well. And then we've got that you might be able to interfere with, but that would be at a nociceptive level. You've got this level 2 that we've talked about, which is around interruption, interference, and identity. And then lastly, this dissociative defense that I mentioned earlier. So let's look at those 3 levels, shall we? There are lots of forms of analgesia that can operate at that homeostatic level. There'll be level 1 homeostasis. I'm just mapping what we currently do onto it. There's what I call non-psychological approaches. Here's my 3rd book of the year. So I used to really annoy me when I was training as a pain scientist, and I'd read all of these clever interventions, and then the back, it's also the back, there'd be a chapter that was called non-pharmacological interventions. What's that? How would you define something by what it's not? It's really odd, isn't it? It's a fundamentally odd thing to do scientifically. What do I mean? So I'm going to flip it. I'm going to start talking about non-psychological interventions. So that, well, other people call that pharmacology, but I call it a non-psychological intervention. There's a plea there to actually define things by what they are. But of course, you can have psychosocial, and we've done a lot of work on the evidence base for for pharmacological interventions in both adults and adolescents and children. And actually, if you don't know about the Cochrane Library, it's sort of free to access. It's and we have really good summaries of all of the pretty much every technology now has been summarized into a systematic review. But of course, there are some psychological interventions that operate at this level 1 level, which is mostly around prevention, mostly around episodic prevention, like forms of psychoanalysis that we've discussed, like placebo, suggestion, information, but also preventative strategies to reduce typically episodic pain. So all of the work in headache, for example, is around better understanding triggers and markers of the onset and the maintenance of those episodes. And the psychological interventions there are focused, if you like, at reducing that onset and reducing those episodes, both the number, the frequency, and the duration of them. So one way of thinking, that's a form of psychological-based analgesia, if you like. So reducing that interruption at that level. But most of the work, of course, that we do in psychology is based at this level 2, which is around once the pain has already impacted on you, once that's part of your life, once this is your reality, and what can we do about it? And of course, there are distraction protocols, and they tend to work quite well in acute pain, but don't work very well in chronic pain, perhaps for obvious reasons, that they're effortful and it's difficult, and you are spending a long time putting effort into trying not to think about something, but the pain will always add. Pain will always find its way back, because that's what it does. It's there to threaten you and protect you through that. So there's an interest at the moment, for those of you interested in trying to reduce those patterns of vigilance. It's an idea that keeps coming in and out of favor, of whether people become too vigilant towards cues of pain, overprotective, if you like. And is there a way in which you can reduce that or not? The evidence isn't great for attentional bias modification, which is trying to train people to not attend towards cues of pain in their environment. It's not particularly good. It's not that good in interpretation bias. In other words, once you've attended to it, changing its meaning. There's very little work on memory bias. But it's a new area. It's an interesting area in pain. It's something that we could look at. But most of the work, of course, is in this level, is in CBT. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy is a broad family of interventions. It's lots of ways of doing cognitive behavioral therapy. Yeah, I won't, and one of the things that frustrates me sometimes is that, especially that's happening at the moment, so people keep inventing new forms of cognitive behavioral therapy. Have you noticed this? Except they look like what went before, but people are sticking a new label on it and trying to sell it. Really frustrates me. It's something we're starting to look at. It's partly because it really confuses the consumer, and it confuses the evidence base, because what we really need is probably a typology, a better representation of exactly what is in each of the different treatments, which is not always available to it. But overall, I mean, this is we've been running a meta-analysis, a systematic review of all of the randomized controlled trials in cognitive behavioral therapy for psychological interventions broadly. For adult chronic pain for the last 20 years. This is the most recent update in 2020, led by Amanda Williams from University College London. And you can read. So there are modest outcomes in adults, good outcomes in children. Very few studies specifically in neuropathic pain. No evidence, which might surprise you, to support acceptance and commitment therapy. There's no evidence not to support it. There just isn't enough evidence for those treatments. And there's a lack, I think, sometimes of development of the types of people we see in clinic, especially now. So we're seeing more and more complex presentations. Very unusual now to see someone with what I might think of as more simple, high-impact chronic pain. People are coming with multi-morbidity, lots of different presentations, especially post-COVID. So those people aren't very well represented in trials. And of course, we're going to come on to talk about some developments in digital therapeutics, including virtual reality. So that whole area, I think, is a real strength of the tradition. That one thing I said to people is, they said to me, "Oh, Chris, that CBT and chronic pain, that's quite interesting. Maybe we should do that, but we'll need to do a trial." I'll say, "Stop. Maybe we do not need to do a trial. This is a standard of care now. Most multidisciplinary pain centers. You're not doing it. You need to be asking why you're not doing it. Not because it's not about the lack of evidence. It's about a lack of understanding or acceptability of it. I think there are we upped the quality criteria of access into this treatment, so it has to be a really good trial now to get into this review. So we dropped the low quality trials, which actually increased the effectiveness, the effect size. And but even there are, I think there are 99 randomized controlled trials. This is not a new area of research. In fact, in the UK, they've now stopped funding CBT trials in chronic pain because it's just accepted now that we should be doing it. But here's an interesting thing. There is an area, that doesn't mean they're necessarily good. For those of you who are eagle-eyed, you would have seen the word modest outcomes. What that means is, in general, some people do really well, but there's a lot of people who don't do very well at all. So the question is, can we do better? And I don't mean trying one flavor of CBT against another. Is how do we really begin to better understand that smaller group of people with more complex presentations who standard CBT is not helping at all? And there's very little work in that area. It's growing. It is growing. So Mark Lumley, for example, is doing some work in emotional awareness and expression therapy. There are other traditions outside of pain in psychotherapy, like compassion and self-forgiveness interventions. There's a rich seam of narrative therapy interventions in social work, in nursing and occupational therapy that's actually quite valuable and could easily move into pain in some ways. And this whole area of looking at what we call social emotions, I think is really very important. If you were to arrive as an alien and open up my 5th textbook of the day in chronic pain, you'd think that the only emotions that existed were depression and anxiety and fear. There'd be very little discussion around embarrassment, guilt, shame, jealousy, pride. These are what we call social emotions because they only really exist in your abstract relationship with other people. People don't get embarrassed on their own. You might physically be on your own, but embarrassment is about the concept of being social. And you're thinking about other people's judgment. And actually, this is really important for those of you who delivered these types of interventions or work with people. Yes, they will talk about negative feelings and thoughts. But if you ask, they'll also quite quickly talk about shame. Quite quickly. And this is not who I want to be. I feel like I'm letting people down. This is not the person that I thought I was going to become. This is not the model of aging. That, and actually, of course, good therapists do that. It's like a secret. Good therapists do this all the time. They just don't talk about it, in the literature at least. But I think there's a whole area here that we could be really investing in more in psychotherapy, I think. And lastly, you remember my 3 levels. So homeostasis, so where you might have psychoanalysis or you might even have non-psychological interventions. Then there's all of the work that we do at that 2nd level. And in the Embodied book, I also talked about the levels of abstraction. There are 3 ways of leaving your body when the sensation will never go away. One is a form of immersion, so you get totally and utterly involved in it. The second is Freud talked about a Das und Heimlich experience, which means unhomeliness, which is that sense of feeling really strange in your own body. And I wanted to introduce an idea of Das Unkorporate, which is an unbodily experience where you feel like it's not yours, it doesn't belong to you. And then lastly, you have these marionette experiences in which you feel like you're being controlled by somebody else. Mostly when people have these experiences, they don't talk about them because they're terrifying. Because if I tell somebody I felt like my body was taken over by somebody else, you might call somebody. And so this is really difficult. Actually, they're quite common. The base rates of these experiences are quite common. Think about height intolerance, what people think of as vertigo. Does anybody here have height intolerance? I do. I do. And actually, the height intolerance is not being scared of heights. It's actually feeling like you're being pulled towards something. You lose agency and you lose control. And that I'm arguing to you, we have an evolved capacity to actually leave your body at times of extreme stress. And there might be opportunities at these level 3 forms of controlled dissociation, like with just the way hypnosis works. And there are people flirting with these different ways of doing things like mirror feedback, presencing. And for the first time, a group in Cambridge last year actually produced experimentally a total body illusion in chronic pain, where somebody could actually separate themselves from their body. Unless you think I've gone completely crazy, in neurology, this is quite big business. This is a lot of interest. What we think of are the agency illusions in neurology. This is in vestibular studies, in particular in ear disturbances or vestibular disturbances, where these types of agency illusions are really quite common, whether you have a heutoscopic experience where you see yourself looking at yourself, or you feel a feeling of a presence where you think that there's someone else in the room looking at you, or you literally have an out-of-body experiences. They're not paranormal psychology, though, as we used to think of at the turn of the last century, where they were much studied as paranormal experiences. And modern neurology has these as largely vestibular system disturbances in these cases. And I'm arguing that we really don't look at these in chronic pain at all. And there's an enormous opportunity for us to do that. Imagine we could harness through technology the immersive properties of being able to dissociate yourself from a painful body long enough to relearn and remap your behavior. Like science fiction, isn't it? And we're getting closer all the time. We're getting closer, and that's one of the reasons that I'm so pleased to be here in Luana and Jason's lab, and this group of really focusing, one of the few groups in the world who are really focusing on exactly these types of solutions. Just before I came in, we had opened a fascinating conversation about, hey, what do we mean by immersiveness? What is that property that you could get to? We've produced a virtual reality solution as well. I just wanted to show you an example of this. This is only one example. Lots of people, no, not actually aren't lots of people. There are only about 4 evidence-based solutions in the world, but it is very early days. We produced a system called Rohia. This is produced in, which is the, I'm sure you know, is the Finnish word for bravery. I know you knew that. I'll test you later. Rohia, Finnish word for bravery. This is built in Finland. And I'll show you, this is published, I'll also show you some results. We were only interested in those with high levels of disability and high levels of fear avoidance. So those who had very strong catastrophic beliefs about their pain, highly avoidant of anything that would might trigger re-injury or further pain and make their pain worse, and had low back pain for, well, it was meant to be for 3 months is the definition, but this is as ever with these populations, has about 11-year chronic pain rate. So these aren't the sort of people you often see in these trials who are volunteer populations, is my point. Often if you look at these VR trials, you'll see people with very low level, mild to moderate pain at the beginning entering. This is the patients that you like to see in a chronic pain clinic. Kinesiophobia or fear of increased pain or movement and re-injury was the primary outcome, and we compared it with a sham control. This is a 6-week intervention where you go in almost every day. It's like cognitive behavioral therapy in a headset. You go in every single day, and on 3 of those days in a week, you get new information on tasks and practices that you need to do in CBT. And on the other days, you're just practicing by yourself. And we had a sham, and that sham means that, so we needed to make sure that wasn't just doing anything, wasn't just the effect of having a headset on. So people will go in every day and they'd explore an environment and have no psychotherapeutic content whatsoever at all. And then we had a waitlist control in that. And that's what you can see. What's interesting is people only start to diverge at week 2 and have different experiences. At the end of the intervention, at week 9, they have sustained intervention. This is another way of putting those data, which is self-reported quality of life, and a visual analog scale of those. And that's digital therapeutics for pain on the left, or the Rohia system. And the middle is the sham placebo and standard care, which is no different. Standard care. But standard care in most chronic pain is no care. And this is another way of putting that information, which is patient global index of change. So people, how much do you think you changed? So that was published in Pain as a prospective double-blind randomized control trial. I'm not saying that this is the best system you should be buying it. What I'm saying to you is that virtual reality is a really exciting opportunity for us. In this case, it's not about sedation or distraction. In this case, it's a vehicle for delivering cognitive behavioral therapy that most people don't get access to. But it's an enhanced form of cognitive behavioral therapy because it has all the immersive properties and the immersive qualities that go with it. Of course, we need a lot more research. It's only the beginning. But I also like it because it was one of the best controlled trials I've ever been involved in. So you can't do sham psychotherapy. Well, yes, you can. It's a long tradition of it. We know how to do it. The other thing about this trial was this is the only trial I've ever been involved in where we had to close recruitment overnight. So we opened it and it was full. And that might say something about people's interest in digital therapeutics, or it might just say something about need and the lack of access to treatment, or maybe both. That was on the cover of Pain. And here's what it looks like. I think I've lost my tech, so I don't know whether I can, if I press it, it'll do it. Oh, yes. This is one of the areas which is called power mounting. And this, for those of you who are in the field, will understand this is an exposure environment where actually you go to the power mountain each time. It's dark, it's scary, there's a cliff. You have to do this task. Remember, this patient has low back pain. So in order to do this task, which is a gamified environment, you have to play a game by doing movements she wouldn't necessarily understand. She is totally immersed in that environment. And cleverly, although you can't see it here, as you get better, so the environment gets lighter, it becomes less scary to do something. So it starts to become better. This is actually version 2 of this treatment, and we've developed it now. The first version will come as no surprise to those of you who speak fluent Finnish, is that it's a log cabin. It's like this beautiful Finnish log cabin. And then there's only one environment outside. This new version has 3 environments, and that's one of them, and actually is longer. However, what we also did in this environment is we added Sammy, who's a semi-autonomous mentoring intelligence. And Sammy is an avatar. And we did a lot of work on this because we said, okay, because this is an automated system, there's no, I meant to say that to you, there's no therapist involved. You never meet a real person. So completely and utterly automated. What we wanted to do was, it was at the beginning, it was just a disembodied voice, and we wanted to add an avatar. So we did a lot of work on what would that avatar look like? How do you design something for maximum relationship building? It's not going to get sacked by somebody. How do you use somebody? And this is what Sammy looks like. It does move, but probably not here, because I haven't got that. And Sammy is, actually, we decided not to go with a real life avatar, with a humanoid looking avatar. Hopefully, if you know anything about computer science, is because if you get them too close to a human, they get that sort of ick factor. And you achieve the opposite of what you want to achieve. So technical research in that, but to create something. And what was difficult about this was actually mapping the facial expressions with the content. What we don't want is Sammy saying, you know, tell me about the negative thoughts, and then it's got a big smile on their face and is laughing. You have to sort of really, we had to map everything closely in together so that it worked together. So I've come a long way, I guess, in this embodied approach. I've started to argue with you that if we go back to fundamentals of why we have these physical sensors, which are driven ultimately to protect you, but when they go wrong, they can go seriously wrong, but they go wrong in a way that we understand, then we can start to help people. Even by doing that, even by explaining to people why these sensors are letting them down. And we've argued, because we've done a lot of it, that we know how to do psychotherapy and rehabilitation, and we know how to do it well. But it still only has modest outcomes. That doesn't surprise me, actually. If you think about, go back to my thought experiment, 10 years of being interrupted by pain every single day, and those intrusive, unpleasant thoughts. It's not something I can switch in one session. It's going to take time. And maybe what VR does is it also, with its immersive properties, is might speed up that learning. Gives us an opportunity to do that, fully immerse somebody and radically speed up all that learning. So what we have here is we presented this at the European Pain Federation in Dublin. Because I don't know how, I should have asked, but I don't know how many practicing psychologists in the room, but this is relatively threatening to some people who find that the idea of an automated system might be threatening, presented in the wrong way. Yeah. The idea that it takes a long time to train to be a psychologist, right? To train to be a really good one with experience takes a very long time. The idea that you can do it with a funny cartoon character is, in the wrong hands, could be potentially insulting. The truth of the matter is, think back where we started, 20% of the population. Doesn't matter how many psychologists we train, we're never getting close to it. And in fact, I've started to argue that what we do in chronic pain management is probably closer to a luxury good than it is to public healthcare. So then there's an uncomfortable idea. Remember what a luxury good is from high school? You know, when the supply is massively outstripped by the demand, so the price goes up. Maybe that's what we're doing. So what I'm trying to do is to say, okay, you have a choice, right? And this is what we're saying here. You can either put that knowledge at the heart of developing these systems and make sure they're right, or you can set your face against it. So, and what we found is when people actually use it, and there's some examples of people using it, that they really liked it. But I took that to pain, to the International Association of Pain's World Pain Congress, about 4,000 people in Toronto last year, the year before last, the end of the year before last. And I challenged Frank Keith, who is, as some of you may know, is the editor of Pain then, to this challenge. I said, okay, let's have a debate. And this was unfortunately, I set it. This was the debate topic. I said the future pain management is going to be wholly digital. I'm going to argue for, and he's going to argue against. And we had that debate. It was called Fight Nights, right? So we had Fight Nights. And Caitlin Berner from Vancouver was a terrific moderator. I mean, she is a smart woman. She is the future of this pain management research in pediatrics. But I think what I just want to focus on here is when we started off that debate, I mean, you know, I'm asking for trouble. I think it was a room full of pain professionals, and I'm saying, I'm going to replace you with digital. At the beginning of the debate, only 24% of people were willing to support this statement. Right? So I had an uphill battle. So 76% voted no. And then after the debate, I like to say that we both win. Basically, I didn't win, but I like to say that we both win because I managed to shift it from 24 to 46, but I still lost. So the point is really not, it's a bit of fun. But the point is we really have to bring the whole of this pain community with us to embrace technology. It might feel like, as part of one of the reasons that I'm here is that you might think that virtual reality is the future because Lana's doing it and I'm doing it and these two labs are doing it, but it's a tiny little part of the world of pain management where people are doing other things. So I've come a long way, and I just wanted to say thank you for your attention and for listening, and hopefully we have some time left for questions. Thank you.